Rob Godfrey. I was Governor Haley's Deputy Chief of Staff for Communications. I worked in the governor's office. It was my second stint in the governor's office. I worked there during the first term, left the governor's office to work on the re-election campaign, came back into the governor's office after Governor Haley was successfully re-elected. So the day-to-day was pretty crazy. She was one of the highest profile governors in the country, if not the highest profile governor in the country. We, of course, had proactively stories we wanted to tell about the work she was doing in South Carolina, delivering results for the people, creating jobs in 46 out of 46 counties, more than 85,000 of them announced over the course of the administration. But there was quite a bit of the inquiries that would come in that were reactive at the time. Because again, she was a high-profile governor. There were a lot of people who had a lot of questions about the things that she was doing, the things she wanted to do in the future. And so we had to try to balance those demands with a legislative session each year, and the role that the communications office played in helping her pass the agenda items that were her priorities over the course of the legislative session. So the communications office, which was 4 to 5 people at any time, was a critical part of the executive office of the governor, and the work we did there is something that I think everyone who worked in there can be immensely proud of. So without question, a re-election by the margin which she was re-elected gave her a mandate to do good for the people of the state. We were optimistic heading into that legislative session, looking forward to working with the legislative leadership and legislative leaders and stakeholders around the state, from the business community to the education community, to do great things. There were everything from economic development was, of course, a priority of Governor Haley, who was known as the jobs governor, to infrastructure, fixing our roads, something that was a very important priority of hers. And heading into the legislative session, I think people were optimistic about the working relationship that she could have, and optimistic about the work ahead, just like you would anytime you're heading into a second term with the wind at your back. I don't think anyone could have imagined what would unfold during that legislative session and after the legislative session and throughout that entire year, because it began with Walter Scott, which was an unspeakable tragedy in South Carolina, where you saw in such graphic detail an unarmed man gunned down by a law enforcement officer. It started there, and that started, of course, an important conversation about body cams. And the result of that was historic body cam legislation that Governor Haley, the Scott family, and members of the General Assembly of both parties were able to commemorate in memory of Walter Scott, which was a tremendous accomplishment. And of course, that was a legislative session that ended, and then we went into that summer, and of course we'll talk about what happened at Mother Emanuel and the debate surrounding the Confederate flag and the aftermath of that. But people forget that was the same year that the flood hit, and so it was a memorable year. It was a significant year in the history of the state. It was a significant year in the history of Governor Haley's story and in the administration. And it's one that I don't think anyone who was working in the governor's office will ever forget. Cool. So I'd gone home after work that day. I had dinner with a work colleague of mine, Tim Pearson. We ate dinner at a restaurant that was near where the both of us lived. And we went home, and we received a text message from the Chief of Staff in the office at the time, James Burns. He sent it to a small group of people, and the text message, if I remember correctly, informed the governor and a group of us that there had been a shooting at a church. He gave the approximate coordinates or the approximate street location of where the church was in Charleston. He'd been in touch with Chief Keel at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, and he was notifying us to be aware of it and to be on the lookout for additional updates soon about what precisely had happened. And at that point, you know, you're taken back by what could have gone on, but I don't think anyone could have imagined what actually would go on to unfold that night. So what we did was we waited for more updates from Mr. Burns. We got a few more of those, and then Governor Haley did what she does, what she did in those in many of those instances. She said she's going to take over, and she's going to run point on what was going to happen. She was in direct contact with Chief Keel. She was in direct contact with the appropriate stakeholders and law enforcement and an emergency response, as governors would be. But Governor Haley really finds her feet in pressure situations like that. She's decisive. She takes action. She charts out a plan, and she knows what she wants to do. And one of the most, and that's what she did with Chief Keel. She, of course, also asked for the phone number of Senator Clemente Pinckney, because once we began to piece through what was going on and where the shooting occurred, we understood that it was Senator Pinckney's church, and that he had a role on Wednesday nights, because it was a Wednesday night, we haven't mentioned that, in Bible study, and she wanted to check on him to understand if there was anything that she could do personally for him or for the church. She called him, left a voicemail, and of course that voicemail was never returned. So I'll tell you a little bit about the day as best as I can recollect 10 years later. We made a decision to go down early in the morning, first thing. A group of us, Governor Haley and a couple of my colleagues, and we went down and arrived. And the first place we went was the Law Enforcement Command Center, which was within eyeshot of where the tragedy unfolded the night before. The command center included law enforcement stakeholders from a number of agencies. I couldn't name what those were, and it also included, I remember, local elected officials were there, state legislators, municipal elected officials, people you would expect, all getting briefings from law enforcement about what was going on. The other thing you have to remember about this time when we arrived there in the morning was this was still an active shooter situation. The criminal who perpetrated the crime at the church had not been apprehended yet, and so people were very much on edge and looking for him. And so we went to the law enforcement command center. The governor was briefed there. She went to the, I believe the name of the hotel was the Embassy Suites, to visit survivors and some of the victims of the families. And then we went to a local hotel to sit down and grab a bite to eat and get our bearings so that we could check in with staff that was in Columbia, emergency managers, Chief Keel, understand where the search for the criminal may be. And also the governor took a call from President Obama during that time, and was preparing for two things: a potential news conference in the event that the criminal was apprehended, and second, to go to the memorial service at Morris Brown AME Church, which she attended in the afternoon, which we all attended in the afternoon, and she sat on the front row with Mayor Riley, Senator Scott, and a number of officials who were there. I remember our group was greeted by Democratic Representative James Smith when we first got there, and there was so much emotion and so much humanity in everyone whom you greeted or whom you saw, that he embraced everyone in our group, and it was such a striking time and such a nice gesture on his part. But when you think back to how fraught our politics are, and even began to be then, and certainly how they are now, the unity, the concern for everyone in the community, and the readiness to cooperate on anything to bring Charleston together, to hold it together, was something that was something I'll never forget. Because what's really critical to remember at this time was that this was a summer, and this was a time of violence happening around the country in other places, in Ferguson, in Baltimore, not precisely at the same time, but in some of these places, Charleston held itself together, and South Carolina held itself together. Governor Haley always likes to say that we turned towards each other and we turned to hugs rather than to violence. And I think that was a concerted effort on the part of all of these elected officials, all of these members of the community, whether they were church leaders, whether they were elected officials, to do that, because no one in South Carolina wanted to see what happened in some of these other places that burned happened here. Before we went to the memorial service at the church, which was a community memorial service, the governor did get the call that the suspect had been apprehended, and she sent one of the state planes to go and bring him back. And so that was what prompted the news conference that you referenced. And the news conference was held in a warehouse type area in downtown Charleston. It was an extraordinarily hot day that day. But I remember one of the presidential campaigns was there. All of the campaigns, some of the campaigns I think had previously scheduled events, they obviously were canceled. But one of the presidential campaigns was trying to hand out water there. The governor appeared with Mayor Riley, law enforcement from the area, other local elected officials. And what she did was she wrapped her arms around this state, and she was honest, and she said this was going to hurt. And in showing that emotion, I think she began to lay a foundation along with colleagues across the General Assembly. I think it's worth pointing out that not one person in any of this process deserves, all of the credit for everything. But what she did was to begin to wrap her arms around the people of the state and hold them together and be honest with them that this was going to hurt, and help to head off any of that real violence and any of that ratcheted up rhetoric that ends up inflaming the emotions in a time like this, and bringing out the very worst in us. And so that's something I think we can all be proud of looking back on. So the next day, so we were in Charleston, obviously. The next day we were also in Charleston. There were a couple of things that happened over the next few days that were striking. Obviously, it has been well covered, and it touched everyone, that when the suspect first appeared before a judge, the victims of the families showed him such tremendous forgiveness that again gave the people of the state permission, I believe, to begin to show him some forgiveness, and to come together around that kind of grace and that kind of example. And that can't be undersold or understated. The example that the survivors and the families demonstrated is something we haven't seen before in this state and may not see again, but it's something that made a huge difference in keeping South Carolina together. And in the days that followed, I remember going with the governor the next day and a couple of my colleagues to the actual church and conducting a couple of TV interviews where, the questions were political in nature. They were about things like guns, and they were about things like the death penalty, and they were about things that were extraordinarily loaded with a context that I don't think the governor wanted to introduce into what was going on right now. She was focused on bringing the state together, keeping the state together, and turning it towards a healing process before injecting politics into it. Without question, one of the first topics everyone wanted to address was what was going to happen with the Confederate battle flag that was on the Statehouse grounds once the website was discovered that this criminal had kept as some sort of journal or whatever it was. She was focused on keeping the state together more than she was on talking to national reporters about, highly political questions. And I think that was a great instinct of hers and something she deserves great credit for. Although she understood also there would be a time for those conversations in the days ahead. So I attended the one with Senator Pinckney where President Obama famously sang "Amazing Grace," and there was nothing more moving than that that I can remember doing over the course of my professional career, and I'm glad I went to that service. It was something that was good for our state and also good for our nation. President Obama at that time embraced his role as comforter-in-chief, and that was something he was always very good at doing. And I think every South Carolinian should be grateful to him for having done that. That was an unbelievable service, and one that no one who was there will forget, and one that no one will forget because of the clips of it that are still available online today. Governor Haley made it a point to go to every one of those funerals because those lives that were taken in a ghastly way, she got to know each one of those individuals, and I think going to each one of those funerals again went a long way to helping keep this state together, and keeping us from falling into the trap of violence and yelling at each other and doing things that wouldn't have been productive, both as the state began to turn towards facing a potential prosecution of that criminal, but also needing to heal during those days. I remember going with the Haley family to the first service, which was on the Sunday following the Wednesday shooting. We went to the first service at Mother Emanuel, and it was one of the most moving and emotional worship services I've ever attended. And what still strikes me to this day was the juxtaposition between the grief and the pain and the mourning, but also the rejoicing of so many of the congregants that they were there together in their house of worship, able to give thanks for the blessings that they still had amidst this great sorrow. And that's an experience I'll never forget. And after that service, we had a meal in Charleston and went back to the residence of the governor. And the governor called senior staff and advisors together. And because the night before, the Saturday before, she had made the final decision and let a group of us, including my colleagues, Tim Pearson, and let us know that I remember a call with the governor, with her husband, with our chief of staff, James Burns, Mr. Pearson. She told us that she'd made the decision, working with her husband, that it was time for the flag to come down, and that she had a plan, and that she would let everybody know the next day. And she got everyone together at the governor's residence, gave them all of their assignments, and everyone was to get together, begin reaching out to legislators of both parties, community leaders of both parties, the federal delegation, members of both parties, get them to the Statehouse the next day, which was a Monday, and prepare for a news conference at which she would deliver a speech that was a memorable one, where she would call for the flag to come down. She was going to ask for each of those folks to stand with her, and she was going to make a promise to them that even if they didn't stand with her, she'd never use it against them in any sort of political context or anything like that. And she was true to her word and has been true to her word to this day. She began to have those meetings the next morning, Monday morning. She talked to, like I said, legislators of both parties, the federal delegation, community leaders, and it was amazing the number of people who showed up to participate, whether it was Senator Thurman's son, Paul Thurman, who was himself serving in the state Senate. That was very symbolic. Whether it was the chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, Jamie Harrison, who's gone on to be the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, whether it was Senator John Corson, who was then, known as one of the most important flag, he'd been one of the most important supporters of, the compromise, keeping the flag on the grounds, and Confederate history over the course of time. He stood with the governor, and that sort of depth and breadth of support and unity helped her give Republicans in the General Assembly the cover they needed to take what was going to be undertake a hard legislative effort to begin the conversation and to ultimately bring the flag down from the grounds and retire it to the conversations that I always heard the governor have about that flag during this time was that the Statehouse complex had to be a place that was welcoming for all South Carolinians. And so within the context in particular, in this sense, of what that criminal who'd gone to Mother Emanuel had done, is that he himself and this is to say nothing of what had happened, externally, what other people had used that symbol for. He had taken that flag and made it into an unmistakable, inexplicable symbol of hate. And many people would tell you that it was already one of those things. But this absolutely, made it, in terms of what he was doing, there was no question about it. And as Governor Haley talked about the Statehouse grounds needing to be a place where all people felt welcome, everyone felt welcome, families, children of all backgrounds, of all experiences. You can't square making the Statehouse grounds a place where all people feel welcome if you have a living, breathing symbol of divisiveness, of the past, of hatred, of things that are very painful. You can't square those two things. And so that was what helped make her understand, how does she explain to her children making the Statehouse grounds a place where everyone can feel welcome but still have a living, breathing reminder or living, breathing symbol of that divisiveness and of that and of those things there. The political risk was something that was a bit of an unknown, because the compromise was at that point 15 years old. It was a bipartisan compromise that so many people had reached. No one had shown an appetite really for revisiting it in any sort of significant way. And so she was in some ways flying blind politically and doing what was right instead of what was politically expedient. She had a gut, she had an instinct that this symbol needed to be removed from the Statehouse grounds, and she was able to give people in the General Assembly the cover to start that conversation and have it. But I think one thing that is a critical point when you have so many people who rush to get in front of cameras or take credit for things in a political context, that's important. And this is not to say that she's ever done that, but there's no shortage of people in Columbia and around the state who would like to take credit for big things happening. What is sad is that it took the deaths of so many innocent people to start the kind of conversation and to start the type of action that we saw on those hot days in June and July of 2015 to get this job done. And I still can't escape that. Look, the senators lost one of their colleagues, one of their own. That's something that none of us can even imagine. I remember filing by the remains of Senator Pinckney when he was lying in repose or lying in state at the Statehouse grounds, and his desk mate, Senator Shaheen, and another friend of his, Senator Lurie, were the two senators who were standing there at the time. And I remember speaking to them and just the sadness, the profound sadness that was a part of watching them was striking. And so the senators lost one of their own, and I don't think there was ever any question of what they would do. When you get to the House, it's obviously a different group of, there are more people. There are more people, which gives you, differing opinions about things, certainly a different group of personalities. And so you had some folks, and I wouldn't call them, I don't have any names to call them, and I don't have any motives to ascribe to what they were doing, other than to say that they weren't ready necessarily for the flag itself to come down, or for the pole itself to come down. They thought maybe you could raise another flag or do something like that. And there were a number of people, Governor Haley included, who were of the opinion that the flag needed to be removed and that the pole needed to come down, because that would take away any sort of potential for there to be another divisive symbol raised in its place that would have kept us in the same place where we were. And so one of the most striking and one of the most moving moments surrounding the legislative debate was that long day where there was House member after House member doing all the work they can, whether they were Democrats, led by Leader Rutherford, or they were Republicans led by any number of people who were legislative heroes that day. There came a time where the debate became bogged down in this, should we leave a certain part up, take a certain part down. Governor Haley went over and spoke to the House Republican caucus and shared her own personal story of having experienced racial discrimination in South Carolina. She spoke in an unvarnished and emotional way from the heart, and I think that it helped move some of her colleagues, some of her old colleagues. And I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think it was just some sort of political, tactician's move. I think it was something that was from the heart, and I think it was something that made a difference. And ultimately, as we saw very early the next morning, I think it was, I don't remember exactly what time, it was between 1 and 2 in the morning or something like that. The final vote took place for the flag to be removed. She signed the bill into law. She gave a pen to a couple of special people in the process. She gave a pen to those who were most closely and directly impacted by the tragedy. And those were families and survivors. She gave pens to Governor Beasley and Governor Hodges, because they had started this conversation many years ago. They were her predecessors who started this conversation many years ago, and I believe Governor Riley as well. And I thought that was appropriate, symbolic, and very much something that made for that kind of brings history together, which is always something you like to see. It was a very hot day, and it began with Governor Haley and Reverend Goff from Mother Emanuel. I remember walking out on the Statehouse steps with them and kind of looking across the crowd. There was a crowd gathering. There were TV cameras gathering and live spots all around. And the group went down and looked over all of that and looked at that flag one more time, and just kind of took it in before going back into the office and preparing and allowing guests to arrive and kind of preparing for the moment that came a few hours later, when that flag actually came down in what was a very respectful ceremony led by then Public Safety Director Leroy Smith, where the flag came down. And I just remember thinking, standing over on the steps, that as the flag came down, there was this rush of emotion through this crowd that had gathered that was unmistakable, and it was pretty, and it was moving, and it was a really, really, really cool thing to see. I think by removing the flag, everyone who had a part in doing it did the right thing, and it's never the wrong time to do the right thing. So I don't think there's any political context within which to consider it, other than the fact that the right thing was done, and it was another step in the healing process for the state. I think that I still unpack some of the things that I saw to this day. I think that going to things like that church service The Sunday after the shooting, the first church service after at Mother Emanuel after the shooting, was something I'll never forget. Just like being at Senator Pinckney's service and hearing President Obama speak. I think it was an unbelievable time in the history of the state. That entire year was, and I'm grateful to have had a front seat and to have played the role that I could play. And it's something that I will be profoundly touched by the rest of my life and profoundly proud of having done. I would like to think that everyone who is elected to office, whenever they take that oath, does so hoping to move South Carolina and this country towards a more perfect union. I think that amid that tragedy, there were actions that were taken, and there were actors who were a part of it, who worked really hard to do their part to make this a more perfect union. But we still have more work to do when it comes to racial reconciliation. We still have more work to do when it comes to living together, and doing so in a way that focuses on the things that we have in common and not the things that drive us apart. And we have a responsibility to each other, not just as neighbors and as friends, but as citizens of the state, to continue to lift each other up. And we've really got to be better when it comes to the way we talk to each other, to the things we talk about, and to the humanity that we face and the grace that we give each other, which is ultimately the legacy that what happened at the Emanuel Church showed us then and should continue to show us.